Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into the past, where sleep wasn't something measured in cycles or tracked by apps. Instead, it followed rhythms far removed from the glowing blue lights and digital interruptions of our modern nights. Before we close our eyes, let's take a moment to settle in. Turn down the lights, maybe switch on that soft hum in the background, and get comfortable. Because we're about to slip into the dreams and night routines of people who lived hundreds of years ago in an age where nighttime was darker, colder, and filled with rituals that now seem oddly foreign. Back then, sleep didn't come in one long stretch. It came in segments, like the night itself was broken into chapters. After dusk, most people would crawl into their makeshift beds and surrender to the first wave of sleep. This initial slumber was known as the first sleep, and it usually lasted about 4 hours. But here's where things turned peculiar. Rather than continuing on into a full night's rest as we do today, people would wake up, not by accident, but as part of the routine. The middle of the night was a kind of intermission, not an inconvenience, and they made use of it. During this pause, some would sit by the fire, adding logs and watching the flames flicker like quiet companions in the stillness. Others prayed in the soft candlelight, whispering verses into the dark. Some might tend to their animals, checking to see that nothing had gone wrong with the livestock during the cold, silent hours. And yes, intimacy was common too. Not as a stolen moment at the end of a long day, but as a natural ritual nestled between sleeps. At a time when the mind had calmed and the body, though briefly stirred, was still warm from rest. This interlude wasn't something to be cured or corrected. No one reached for potions or fretted about insomnia. Waking up in the middle of the night was expected. It was practical. It was normal. After this watchful hour or two, they would slip back under their covers, if they had any, and drift into what was simply known as the second sleep, carrying them through until dawn. This pattern, segmented sleep, was so deeply embedded in medieval life that writers like Chaucer referred to it casually, without explanation. It was just how people lived. Curiously, modern science has revisited this idea and found something surprisingly affirming. In the absence of artificial light and busy schedules, our bodies may naturally prefer this two-sleep rhythm. Our circadian systems, those delicate, ancient clocks ticking inside us, seem to follow a similar cadence when left to their own devices. So, if you ever find yourself blinking into the darkness at 2 a.m., wondering why your rest has abandoned you, don't reach for blame. Instead, remember that your ancestors might have greeted this wakefulness with prayer, quiet reflection, or a stretch beside the hearth. The night was not lost. It was simply paused. Sleep in the Middle Ages wasn't simply a matter of drifting off. It was an experience wrapped in discomfort, pragmatism, and, quite often, straw. Today, we fret over thread counts, gel foam, orthopedic alignment, and cooling mattresses that promise the sleep of angels. But centuries ago, the average person lay down not upon a bed as we would recognize it, but upon something much closer to a haystack in a borrowed shirt. For most people, especially peasants, a bed was little more than a makeshift nest built out of what nature had on hand and society allowed. Straw was the unsung hero of the medieval night. Dried, coarse, and often reused until it flattened to a brittle mat, it was piled into sacks made from scratchy, worn cloth, if the family was fortunate enough to have that. Otherwise, it was spread directly onto the dirt floor, where it mingled freely with insects, damp air, and the occasional wandering cat. These straw beds, known as pallets, didn't offer luxury. They offered insulation and a barrier between flesh and the cold earth, and even that was considered something to be grateful for. Sleep was a still performance. Moving too much might stir the mice or annoy the lice, and lice, by the way, weren't exclusive to the poor. Even nobility found themselves scratching beneath embroidered linens. But for the common folk, There was no linen to speak of. They slept in the same garments they wore throughout the day, and the idea of changing into designated sleepwear would have seemed wasteful or absurd. Clean clothes were rare. Warmth mattered more than modesty. And personal space? That was a modern concept centuries from invention. Entire families, parents, children, sometimes a grandmother, sometimes a cousin, all packed together like salted fish, shared the same sleeping space. There was no privacy, only proximity. And when the fire died out and the night turned cold, that closeness wasn't just tolerated, it was survival. A sharp elbow in your ribs or the snoring breath of a sibling in your ear was a small price to pay for not waking up frostbitten. For those higher on the social ladder, sleep took on a different appearance, though not necessarily a more comfortable one. The wealthy had actual bed frames, often carved from oak or walnut, sometimes ornate enough to suggest their owner's rank. Atop these frames rested mattresses filled with feathers or wool, softer than straw, but equally prone to housing unwelcome guests. These beds were precious, passed down through generations, often included in wills, not for sentiment, but because they were expensive, irreplaceable, and deeply practical. A noble might not bequeath you land, but they might leave you their bed, lumpy feathers and all. Canopies and heavy curtains enclosed these beds not merely as decoration but as insulation. Drafts seeped through stone walls and ill-fitted shutters, so beds became microclimates, islands of warmth and marginal cleanliness amid the biting chill of the night. Some nobles even slept beside braziers or within curtained alcoves to trap their own body heat. But regardless of class, nighttime in medieval Europe was never entirely about rest. Sleep was a necessity, a break in the rhythm of toil. But it was never entirely safe, clean, or guaranteed. It was something you prepared for, endured, and emerged from. If you were lucky, you woke up without fleas in your ears or a pig having claimed the warmest spot on the floor. And if you were truly fortunate, you might have dreamt of something other than chores, cold, or hunger. The modern idea of the bed as a place of refuge, luxury, or romance would have felt alien to most medieval sleepers. Back then, a bed was a shield, a thin one, against the elements, the creatures, and the uncomfortable realities of life. You didn't expect comfort, you hoped for quiet, you prayed for warmth. And if your sleep was interrupted, it wasn't by a phone, but by a child kicking in their dreams, a dog growling at shadows, or your own body reminding you that the floor was, in fact, still beneath you. In the modern imagination, a nightcap conjures images of warm drinks by the fire. A splash of whiskey, perhaps, something to ease the mind and coax the body into slumber. But for medieval folk, a nightcap was no drink at all. It was quite literally a cap, a piece of fabric worn to bed, not for style but for sheer survival. You see, medieval homes were not havens of warmth. The architecture of the time, charming as it may appear to us now, was a sieve for cold. Stone walls did little to contain heat. Roofs were often thatched and drafty. Windows, if present, were more likely made from stretched animal bladder or oiled parchment than anything resembling glass. The chill crept in from every crevice. And since body heat escapes most rapidly from the head, it was only logical that people began covering it. So they did, with nightcaps. These humble hats were made from whatever cloth could be spared, wool, linen, or leftover scraps, sewn into a cone or tube that flopped like the ear of a weary rabbit. Men wore them without shame. Women often wore theirs tied under the chin or styled like coifs, doubling as modesty veils in a world where even sleep didn't exempt you from moral decorum. Some caps were simple and plain, others embroidered with thread, a quiet flourish of status or vanity even in the dark. But beyond warmth, these nightcaps carried social weight. In certain towns, a woman was expected to keep her head covered even while she slept. A bare scalp was more than a chill risk. It was a potential scandal. And for the urban elite, opening your door while wearing a nightcap sent a very clear message. This conversation had better be short, or preferably not happen at all. Alongside these caps came the nightshirt, a loose, tunic-like garment worn by both sexes. These weren't elegant or fashionable. They were practical, itchy, and flammable. Picture the ghost of Christmas past, or a medieval version of Ebenezer Scrooge without the personal redemption arc. You didn't wear them to look good. You wore them because wool robes and belts were cumbersome, and sleeping in your work clothes meant you were always ready, whether for prayer, fire, or flight. Of course, these layers did little for privacy. And in a world where walls were thin, doors were rare, and fireplaces were central gathering places, the idea of sleeping alone was almost luxurious. For travelers, it was unheard of. Imagine this. You're a merchant, a pilgrim, or just someone unlucky enough to have lost a wheel halfway to York. You stumble upon an inn. Tired, cold, and desperate for rest, you pay the keeper and ask for a bed. But what you receive is not your own room, nor even a bed to yourself. Instead, you are shown to a narrow wooden frame already sagging under the weight of someone else. A stranger, snoring, wheezing, possibly contagious, is now your bedmate. You will sleep elbow to elbow, blanket to blanket, perhaps even cheek to cheek if the wind howls hard enough. This was not considered odd. It was economy. Inns were expensive to run. Beds were few and demand was high. If there was space, it would be filled. Sometimes beds hosted 2 or 3 people. In cities, sleeping halls looked more like military barracks than inns. Rows of sleeping forms crammed like grain sacks in a storage barn. Men and women were occasionally separated, but not always. Assignments were based on profession when possible. Tanners with tanners, monks with monks, thieves with other thieves, at least in theory. And if you feared theft, which you should, you slept with your purse tied to your waist or your bundle wedged beneath your head. Your belongings became your pillow and your alarm. If someone moved your bag, it meant they weren't reaching for an extra blanket. They were reaching for your future. Nobles, of course, did not face this indignity. They traveled with servants, guards, and demands for privacy. An innkeeper knew better than to cross a noble who might ride off with more than just his reputation. But for the common traveler, sleep was communal, crowded, and cautious. So, the next time you fall into your memory foam mattress and pull up your pristine sheets, spare a thought for your ancestors. Bundled in scratchy tunics, caps slipping sideways, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, grateful for warmth, and hoping no one beside them snored louder than the dog at the foot of the bed. To close one's eyes in the medieval world was never a trivial act. Sleep, in that shadowed era, was not merely a time to rest one's bones. It was a perilous crossing, a nightly wager made with the unknowable. Every evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon and the cold crept in, people prepared themselves not just for sleep, but for the very real possibility that they might never awaken. Because in those centuries, death wasn't a far-off notion. It was intimate, familiar, and always nearby. Illness struck without warning. Fires ignited in thatched roofs from a single wayward ember. Bandits roamed. Plague lingered like smoke in the corners of crowded homes. A cough in the evening could become a funeral by dawn. And so, before sleep, people prayed. Not for comfort, but for protection. Not for peace of mind, but for the safekeeping of their souls. Bedtime was a ritual. Not lavender sprays or soft lullabies, but whispered psalms, memorized invocations, and whispered apologies to heaven. A man might confess sins he could barely speak aloud. A mother might pray over each child, naming them one by one as if shielding them with every syllable. And always there was the looming phrase, "If I should die before I wake." A simple rhyme for us now, but once it was said with trembling sincerity. Children were taught early that angels watched over them, but these weren't always comforting, cherubic guardians. Sometimes they were presented more as celestial sentinels, keeping score, ready to intervene or report back. It was divine surveillance, not warmth. And if your conscience wasn't clear, sleep could become a corridor leading straight to damnation. Monks and nuns, those whose entire lives were dedicated to the sacred, took this even further. Each night, before rest, they observed Compline, the final canonical prayer of the day. Afterward, they took a vow of silence, not a gentle quietude, but a strict, deliberate muteness, as if to muffle all temptation until the light returned. Words, they believed, had weight, and unnecessary words, spoken between dusk and dawn, might tip the scales of eternity. And then there were dreams. In our world, we dismiss dreams as mental static, fragments of thought and memory stitched together by a brain that refuses to shut down. But to medieval minds, dreams were messages, sacred, dangerous, unavoidable. Dreams were taken seriously, not just by peasants, but by priests, theologians, even kings. If you dreamed of water, it might mean cleansing, or it might foretell drowning. Fire could symbolize divine fury or hellfire. To dream of a goat-headed man juggling fish, well, that might be a sign that a priest should be summoned immediately, preferably before breakfast. There were manuals written to interpret these visions, filled with symbols and their supposed meanings. Some clergy became so invested in dream analysis, they were seen as oracles of the subconscious, long before psychology gave it a name. Monks recorded their dreams in journals. Some claimed visitations from saints or spirits. Others confessed their dreams to superiors, afraid that even the mind's private wanderings might reveal hidden sin. Because to sleep, in this worldview, was to unmoor the soul from the body. And what the soul did in that liminal space mattered. A dream of stealing could be read as gluttony. A vision of falling might hint at pride, and though the dreamer had no control, they were still held accountable. There was a line, of course, between divine revelation and demonic attack. Not all dreams were welcomed. Some were feared. A seductive dream, a violent vision, a whispering voice in the night. These were considered more than nightmares. They were traps. The devil, it was believed, did not sleep. And while you lay defenseless in your pile of straw, he might be whispering poison into your dreams. And so the night was not silent, even if the room was. It was a time of invisible battles. Prayers whispered like armor, dreams scrutinized like prophecies. To sleep was to drift into a world where your soul walked without you, where angels and devils argued in silence, and where waking up wasn't promised, just hoped for. Today, letting a dog sleep at the foot of the bed is often seen as an act of affection, a little indulgence for the cozy-hearted. But in the Middle Ages, sharing a bed with an animal wasn't about affection. It was about heat and survival. Homes, especially those of peasants and villagers, were frigid, cramped, and built for necessity rather than comfort. A single-room cottage might serve as kitchen, living space, bedroom, and stable all at once. There were no thermostats, no insulated walls, no fireplace crackling merrily in every corner. What they had, and often relied on, were animals. Livestock didn't sleep outside. They shared the same roof. Chickens wandered across the floor. A goat might rest beside the hearth. Pigs huddled near the family straw pile, and all of them exhaled warm air, radiating a kind of rustic heat that no blanket could match. In the brutal chill of a medieval winter, a pig could mean the difference between a restless night and frostbite. To modern ears, this may sound chaotic, and in many ways, it was. Dogs barked in their sleep. Cows lowed softly. Chickens rustled or clucked if disturbed. But for medieval families, this was normal, even comforting. These creatures were more than property. They were heat sources, alarm systems, and living proof that the family was still fed and functional. Children often fell asleep with their arms wrapped around a hound or nestled beside a sheep. A cow in the room could raise the ambient temperature just enough to make the night bearable. And if the dog jumped on your legs in the middle of the night, that wasn't a nuisance, that was insulation. Of course, there were drawbacks. Cleanliness was a fluid concept. Droppings, fleas, and the occasional loud squabble between animals were part of the nightly soundtrack. But the medieval home wasn't built around the idea of separation. Humans and animals coexisted, not as companions, but as fellow survivors of the cold, dark world outside their walls. Wealthier homes, of course, didn't keep livestock underfoot. But even among nobles, animals made their way into bedrooms. Lapdogs, in particular, were a status symbol. Small, perfumed, and absurdly pampered, they nestled into feather beds more out of fashion than function. Still, even these dainty creatures had a job to do: spread fleas. Because no matter how rich you were, vermin made no distinctions. In some aristocratic households, pets even had their own rooms. Not out of love, but to show that their owners could afford such extravagance. But for most, animals slept where people did. The floor, the straw pile, even the bed itself. It was a noisy, smelly, jostling affair, and yet strangely intimate. A reminder that life, in all its messy, loud, interwoven nature, didn't stop when the sun went down. It simply curled up beside you. So the next time your cat jumps on your chest at 3 a.m. or your dog snores through your dreams, remember, it could be worse. You could be sharing your bed with a goat, 3 chickens, and the faint hope that none of them decide to relieve themselves while you sleep. In monasteries, sleep was not a comfort. It was a concession, reluctantly granted by the strict rules of devotion, and taken only when the body could no longer endure the weight of wakefulness. If the typical medieval home offered a bed full of family and livestock, the monastery offered something entirely different: quiet, order, and discipline. But rest, that was another matter entirely. Imagine a long, cold room built of stone, high ceilings arching like silent witnesses, above rows of identical sleeping places. These weren't bedrooms. They were dormitories in the truest sense. Communal, stark and indifferent to the idea of privacy. Dozens of monks, each clad in the same scratchy robes they had worn all day, lay side by side on wooden planks. If they were lucky, and the abbot generous, a thin layer of straw or cloth softened the surface. But that was rare, after all. Softness was a temptation, and monks were taught to resist. These were men who had taken vows to turn away from the world and its comforts, and their beds reflected that belief. There were no pillows, no curtains, no soft glow of firelight, just the darkness, the scent of wax and stone, and the rustle of robes as the faithful lay down, not to indulge in rest, but to recover just enough for the next hour of prayer. Because in monasteries, night was never truly a time for sleep. It was fractured, regulated, and pierced by the tolling of bells. At some unfathomable hour, often 2 or 3 in the morning, a bell would ring out, harsh and echoing through the stone halls. It was the call to matins, the first service of the day. Not morning, not yet. This was the deep night, a time when even the owls hesitated to stir. And yet, the monks rose. There was no fumbling for candles, no changing into sleepwear. They were already dressed, always dressed. Their robes were more than garments. They were a uniform of endurance. And so they shuffled in silence to the chapel, cold feet against colder floors, every breath a mist in the unheated corridors. Inside, lit only by flickering candles, they chanted psalms and read scriptures aloud. Their voices rose and fell like the tide, steady, solemn, and laced with exhaustion. Some nodded off mid-verse, heads drooping only to jerk awake. Sleep during prayer was frowned upon, and punishments were handed out. A monk who dozed too often might find himself cleaning latrines or carrying water for a week. Spiritual discipline came with very earthly consequences, and yet, beneath all this austerity, there was purpose. The night belonged to God, they believed, and offering the stillest, loneliest hours to Him was an act of devotion. To rise in the cold and darkness was to separate oneself from the temptations of comfort, to demonstrate faith not with words, but with weariness. After matins, depending on the order and its rules, some monks were allowed to return to their plank beds for a second sleep. Others moved directly into study, meditation, or labor. There was no leisurely waking, no time to linger in a dream. Life in the monastery was a rhythm, relentless, sacred, and spare. And through all of it, silence reigned. Not the peaceful kind found in solitude, but the enforced hush of obedience. Words were rationed. Conversations were limited. Even a groan from a stiff back could earn a stern glance. Only the snoring broke the rules? Reluctantly tolerated because even the most pious could not silence their lungs. For these men, sleep wasn't rest, it was training, a rehearsal for death, a discipline for the soul, to sleep with no indulgence, to dream with no distraction. This was their calling. And while the world outside fretted over straw beds and goats underfoot, the monks of Christendom lay motionless in the dark, learning, in their way, how to suffer without complaint. In the modern world, to sleep alone is often framed as a luxury, a space of peace, independence, and, perhaps, blessed quiet. But in the Middle Ages, to sleep by yourself was a strange thing, suspicious even, dangerous. The solitude that we now seek was, back then, a signal that something was wrong. Start with the practical. Nights in medieval Europe were not gentle. Cold air poured through walls and crept under doors. Blankets were few, fires died quickly, and clothing had to do the work of insulation. If you lay down alone, you had no one to borrow warmth from. Children huddled with siblings. Parents clutched their little ones. Visitors were folded into the straw like spare tools. It wasn't about affection. It was about heat. If someone lay beside you, you might wake up stiff and sore. If no one did, you might not wake at all. But it wasn't just the chill that made sleeping alone seem foolish. There was something darker in the medieval imagination, a sense that night itself was haunted. That in those long, silent hours when the world turned inward and the fire dimmed to embers, unseen forces walked freely. The devil, it was said, did his work in the dark, and those who slept alone were especially vulnerable. To sleep by oneself was to lower your defenses. Without the presence of others, without their breathing, their warmth, their prayers, your soul might drift too far. Temptation was thought to be stronger in isolation. A demon, after all, needed silence and space to slip in. And if you were alone, who would know if you awoke different? Who would see the moment your eyes no longer looked quite like yours? Parents warned children never to sleep in solitude, not just because of wolves or cold or hunger, though those were real enough, but because the night was full of spirits, ghosts, fairies, whispers. And if a child vanished into sleep and never came back, the explanation was often found not in illness or accident, but in the idea that some creature had taken them in the dark. Even married couples often shared their beds not just with one another, but with servants, children, guests. Beds were shared because privacy was not a virtue. It was a threat, a sign of secrecy, of sin. A couple sleeping alone in a room by themselves, with no child between them, no witness beside them. It was strange, almost theatrical. Why the isolation, people wondered. What were they hiding? What did they intend? In monasteries, too, sleep was rarely solitary. Monks shared their dormitories. And if one was assigned to sleep alone, it was rarely a reward. It might mean punishment, a sign of correction, or worse, suspicion. The solitary sleeper, in a world built on watchful community, invited scrutiny simply by their distance from others. The logic was simple. A soul was safer when surrounded. If evil came in the night, better to have others near. To witness it, to fend it off, or, in darker thinking, to absorb the danger in your place. Misfortune, like fire, spread slowly, and with others nearby you might be spared. So next time you curl into the blankets of your private bed, safe behind closed doors, in a room lit only by your lamp or the distant hum of a passing car, remember that for most of history, this was unthinkable. In the deep of night, you would have shared that space with a child, a cousin, a stranger, or a dog. Not for comfort, not for conversation, but because to sleep alone was to open the door, not just to the cold, but to everything that lived in it. We tend to think of sleeping as a full-body surrender. The stretch of limbs, the softness of pillows, the luxury of lying flat and letting gravity take over. But in the medieval world, even the act of reclining could raise eyebrows. There were many who chose not to sleep fully horizontal at all. They slept propped up, backs resting against bolsters, walls, or wooden headboards, in postures that to us might look more like a weary traveler dozing in a carriage than someone settling in for the night. Why would anyone do this voluntarily? The reasons, as with many medieval habits, were a tangle of superstition, medicine, and spiritual anxiety. First, there was the belief, held sincerely by doctors of the day, that sleeping flat on your back was dangerous. Lying down, they warned, encouraged bad humors to settle. Fluids would pool in the lungs. Digestion would stall. Even the brain, they said, might fill with black bile and fog the senses. These weren't fringe ideas. This was mainstream thought, passed down from ancient texts and repeated by university-educated physicians. The body, they believed, worked like a delicate plumbing system, and sleep could cause clogs. An upright position, or at least a partial incline, was considered healthier. It allowed for airflow, prevented choking, and kept the head elevated in case of coughing, which, in a world without antibiotics, might be the first sign of something deadly. And so, many chose to sleep at an angle, resting in what we might now call a semi-reclined posture, their bodies arranged less like dreamers and more like patients perpetually bracing for a visit from death. But the medical fears were only part of the story. There were spiritual concerns as well. Darker, older, harder to dislodge. To lie flat was, quite literally, to resemble the dead. Corpses were stretched out on their backs. That position, arms down, legs straight, eyes closed, was the pose of finality, the position in which one was wrapped in a shroud, laid in a box, and lowered into the ground. For many, it felt like inviting fate, tempting death. Why pretend to be dead, they wondered, when you might be mistaken for the real thing? There were whispered fears, too, that lying down fully at night might confuse the soul, that it might slip away during sleep and forget how, or whether, to return. And if a soul wandered too far, demons could find the empty shell of the body and take up residence. An upright sleeper, it was believed, was safer, watchful, even in rest, half awake in posture, if not in mind. The very devout took this to extremes. Some monks, determined to deny themselves all earthly comfort, slept seated, back straight, chin drooping only slightly. Others rested against cold stone walls, using their robes as cushions. There are even accounts of men sleeping while sitting on wooden benches, arms folded like penitents, as if sleep itself were a temptation to be wrestled with, not enjoyed. The nobles, too, had their contraptions. Special beds were designed with angled supports. Great carved frames with adjustable rests allowed the wealthy to sleep partially upright, attended by servants who tucked them in like living statues. It was said to aid digestion, especially important after heavy evening meals. and to keep them ready should a messenger or assassin arrive unexpectedly in the dark. Of course, these arrangements weren't comfortable. But then again, that wasn't the point. Medieval sleep was rarely about comfort. It was about discipline. It was about fear, about order and obedience, and not being caught off guard by the dangers, physical or spiritual, that might lurk just beyond the reach of the firelight. So, while you stretch out across your mattress tonight, arms flung wide, legs tangled in cool sheets, remember, there was a time when sleep meant sitting upright in a tunic, trying not to snore, hoping the devil mistook your posture for a prayer. In modern life, when something keeps you up at night, it's usually a phone buzzing on the nightstand, a neighbor's car alarm, or the wandering stress of the day. But in medieval times, the true invaders of sleep didn't come with noise or drama. They came silently, crawling, biting, multiplying, and they never left. Lice, fleas, and bed bugs were the real monsters in the medieval bedroom. Small, tireless, and entirely immune to prayer. For people of that era, these pests weren't a surprise. They were an expectation. You didn't ask if there were insects in the bed. You only asked how bad the night would be. Let's begin with the basics: hygiene, or more accurately, the lack of it. Bathing was rare, often considered either sinful or dangerous to the body's internal balance. Laundry was labor-intensive and expensive, requiring water, fire, space, and time. Luxuries that few possessed. Soap existed, but it was harsh, scarce, and sometimes made from substances that smelled worse than the problems it was meant to solve. Now add to that environment straw mattresses, reused over and over, shared between family members, travelers, even animals. These beds were ideal breeding grounds. Fleas nestled in the seams. Lice made homes in hair. Clothing and linens, if you had them. And bed bugs, the silent assassins of rest, crept into the cracks of wood, the corners of walls, the folds of nightshirts. No one was immune. Peasants scratched through the night. Children learned to sleep in stillness, resisting the urge to squirm when something bit. Even nobles, tucked into feather beds beneath embroidered sheets, weren't spared. The sheets might have been finer, the curtains more elegant, but the insects did not care. In fact, richer households often had more hiding places, elaborate furniture, layers of bedding, and the bugs thrived. Some nobles hired servants whose sole job was to hunt lice. These nitpickers, a term that survives in language, though its origins have long been forgotten, would spend hours carefully inspecting their master's hair and garments, removing tiny invaders one by one. Imagine holding that job title, defender of the royal scalp. As for the rest, everyone had their own tactics. Strong-smelling herbs like wormwood, tansy, or lavender were burned or scattered near sleeping areas to drive out pests, or at least confuse them. People lined their beds with garlic, onions, ashes, or soot. Some even slept with crushed rosemary in their clothes. It didn't always work, but it made you smell too strange to cuddle, which solved other problems. Nightcaps, those iconic bedtime accessories, served a dual purpose. Yes, they kept your head warm in the drafty chill, but they also offered a thin line of defense against insects crawling into your hair or ears. Long nightshirts covered arms and legs, not out of modesty, but because the more skin you could hide, the fewer bites you'd wake up with. Still, it was never enough. Fleas were constant companions, seen not as pests, but as reminders of sin. It was said that Adam and Eve's fall had brought these tormentors into the world, and they were biting proof of mankind's moral corruption. Some medieval poets even wrote verses about fleas, half moral, half romantic, likening them to tiny symbols of union. "The flea that bites us both," they would write, trying to spin affection from discomfort. The bite, as it turns out, made for better poetry than passion. Sleep in those centuries was not just broken by dreams, prayers, or livestock. It was disrupted by twitches, scratching, the slow, maddening awareness that something, many things, were moving under the covers. You learned to endure, to sleep lightly, to ignore the itching unless it drew blood. So when we talk about medieval sleep, let's not forget this part. The quiet, unrelenting war waged every night beneath the blanket. It was not just about cold or fear or superstition. It was about sharing your bed with a kingdom of parasites that neither bowed to kings nor feared monks. You weren't alone. You were never alone. And sometimes the most persistent companions of the night were the ones too small to see, but impossible to ignore. In today's world, the idea of sleeping in jeans is enough to make most people shudder. Too stiff, too restrictive, too unforgiving. Now imagine trading denim for chainmail, not for a costume party, not for a parade, but because you might be attacked before dawn. In the Middle Ages, sleep didn't always come with the luxury of safety. For soldiers, knights, and anyone traveling through hostile lands, bedtime wasn't about softness. It was about survival, and that meant keeping one foot, or at least one shoulder, in armor. Let's be clear, no one wanted to sleep in full armor. The romantic image of knights dozing off in gleaming plate suits is more fiction than fact. A full suit was hot, loud, and heavy. Trying to lie down in it was like being buried in a rickety metal coffin. Rolling over felt like turning a barrel of scrap iron. The helmet muffled your breath. The gauntlets pinched, and the groaning of chain links followed every twitch of your muscles. But during campaigns, sieges, or tense nights on the road, removing your armor was a risk few were willing to take. Attacks could come at any time, not just with the rising sun, but at midnight, when sleep had softened you, when your sword was out of reach, when your defenses were lowered with your eyelids. So many chose the compromise. Partial armor. A knight might take off his helmet and gauntlets, but keep the breastplate strapped tight. A man-at-arms might sleep in his gambeson, a thick, quilted jacket worn under armor, thick enough to offer some protection, thin enough to allow movement. Weapons were never full. A sword rested at arm's length. A shield doubled as a pillow. You might dream of home or glory, or you might wake with your hand already on the hilt, heart racing at the sound of hooves. In castles under threat, even the civilian garrison slept half-dressed, with spears propped near their bunks and doors barred with furniture. A surprise attack didn't wait for morning. In those moments, the best bed was the one you could leap from and fight back in before your name became a footnote in someone else's saga. There were practical concerns, of course. Armor wasn't breathable. Sleep in it too long and your skin would blister. Sweat pooled in all the wrong places, and the smell, gods help anyone downwind. Chainmail had a distinct scent after a long campaign. Metal, grime, fear, and whatever food you dropped on yourself 3 days ago. But smell was a small price to pay if it meant you'd still be breathing when the rooster crowed. Even travelers outside the battlefield faced similar calculations. A merchant carrying valuable goods might sleep in a padded vest, dagger tucked under his cloak. Guards on long night shifts would nap in turns, sometimes dozing in position, leaning against wooden beams with their boots still on and one eye half open. In rough regions, you didn't remove your armor. You wore your fear like a second skin. And then there were the sounds. Armor doesn't sleep quietly. One wrong movement and you'd rattle like a drawer full of cutlery. The clang might wake your companions, or worse, alert your enemies. A snoring knight in steel could be a beacon in the dark, a living wind chime for anyone listening. But that was the price. You sacrificed rest for readiness, comfort for caution, and when you rose the next morning, stiff-necked, eyes heavy, bruises blooming beneath your armor, you didn't complain. You were still alive. That was enough. So no, sleeping in armor wasn't romantic. It wasn't heroic. It was desperate, but it was also necessary. Because in a world where war was always a breath away, even dreams had to be ready to draw steel. We know what sleepwalking is. A harmless quirk, a half-waking state where the body rises and drifts while the mind remains curled somewhere in a dream. Today, we might laugh about it. Someone making toast in the dark, mumbling nonsense into a hallway, or mistaking a closet for a bathroom. But in the medieval world, there was no laughter. Sleepwalking was no joke. It was a sign, and not a good one. To rise from your straw pallet in the middle of the night, eyes open but unseeing, limbs moving with eerie purpose. That wasn't just strange. That was supernatural. Possession, bewitchment, or perhaps worse. A soul untethered and wandering. They had no words for sleep disorders, no science to explain parasomnia. What they saw was something uncanny. A man who stood upright in his sleep and muttered Latin he didn't know. That was not fatigue. That was demonic, or cursed, or maybe already half dead. In villages, people whispered about it. If someone was known to walk in the night, step soft on dirt floors, face pale in candlelight, they became an object of quiet dread. Was their soul still in their body, or had something taken its place? Clergy feared it. Physicians couldn't explain it. Families were left to manage it as best they could, often with fear as their only tool. Some tied sleepers to their beds with rope or bound a leg to a bench to keep them grounded. Others placed iron near the bed, a knife under the pillow, a horseshoe near the door, believing these would repel spirits or trap wandering souls inside the flesh. In one telling, a sleepwalker climbed onto a roof, whispering prayers that didn't match any known liturgy. He was found just before dawn, balanced on the edge, his eyes wide and blank. After that, the windows were barred. There were darker stories too. Tales of people who never came back to bed, who walked out into the woods or down to the river and were never seen again. Were they taken? Did something call to them in their dreams? Or did they simply keep walking, lost in a world halfway between sleep and death? The church, unsurprisingly, had opinions. Some monks believed the soul was vulnerable during sleep, detached just enough from the body for dark forces to enter. Sleepwalking was evidence, a soul confused, a spirit wandering where it shouldn't. If someone sleepwalked too often, they might be taken aside and questioned. Had they confessed recently? Had they seen visions? What sins had they left undeclared? Even among the faithful, it was seen as a warning that perhaps the dreamer was not as pure as they seemed. Not every case led to panic. Some communities accepted it in quiet dread, praying harder before bed, blessing the threshold, lighting an extra candle. But no one truly relaxed. Because in a world where night itself was dangerous, a body that moved without a will was terrifying. And so, sleepwalking became more than a disorder. It became a symbol of fear, of the unknown, of the fragile line between this world and whatever waited in the dark beyond it. Because if you could rise in your sleep, speak in tongues, walk among the silent and not remember it, who was really in control? Today, we search for silence. We invest in soundproof windows, white noise machines, sleep playlists engineered to mimic waves or gentle rain. But for the medieval sleeper, quiet was a luxury so rare it was almost mythical. Their nights rang with chaos, and yet somehow they slept. Start with the bells. Church bells. Monasteries and cathedrals tolled them not just at dawn, but throughout the day and night, marking the sacred hours with iron chimes that echoed across fields and stone streets. Matins at 2 a.m, lauds before sunrise. Each bell wasn't just a sound. It was a command, a spiritual summons. And if you lived near a monastery, you didn't sleep despite the bells. You slept through them, or you learned to. Then there were storms. Not the muffled rumbles of distant thunder softened by double glazing and drywall, but raw, untamed, tempests. Winds screamed through the gaps in timber and thatch. Rain struck rooftops like falling stones. Windows, if you had them, were made of oiled parchment or thin horn. They shook and rattled like leaves in a gale. Chimneys howled, fires sputtered, and yet people curled beneath rough blankets and tried to ignore the sky tearing itself open above their heads. And let's not forget the animals. In a one-room home shared by humans and livestock, the night was alive with snorting, clucking, scratching, and the occasional hoof stomping near your head. Chickens shifting on their roost, dogs growling at things unseen, pigs shuffling in the straw, dreaming their own strange dreams. To sleep in that world was to embrace noise, to make peace with it. The ambient soundscape of medieval sleep was a soundtrack of survival. But the noise didn't stop at nature. War, too, had its rhythms. Sieges dragged on for weeks. Soldiers camped near city walls, singing, shouting, and sometimes dying just beyond earshot. Villages knew the thrum of approaching hooves, the clank of weapons in the distance. Invasions were real, not hypotheticals. The sound of unfamiliar men approaching under cover of night wasn't just frightening. It was a warning, and still, people slept, because exhaustion was deeper than fear. In times of famine, they slept hungry. In times of plague, they slept knowing the fever might claim them before morning. And when death carts rolled down the streets at dawn, collecting those who hadn't survived the night, the living still closed their eyes again. Not out of peace, but because they had no choice. The body, worn thin by work, prayer, cold, and grief, demanded sleep, even if the world burned just beyond the door. There are stories of people sleeping through earthquakes, barn fires, and riots, children napping in doorways while mobs passed through, monks nodding off mid-chant, even as thunder cracked through stained glass windows. The line between rest and waking was blurred by necessity. Sleep was not delicate. It was not curated. It was stolen, carved out in pockets between chaos and duty. And for some, sleep became escape. When the world felt too sharp, too brutal, too unrelenting, people pulled their cloaks tighter and surrendered to dreams. Not because they hoped for peace within them, but because closing one's eyes was the only refuge they had. So the next time you toss and turn because of a neighbor's music or a car alarm in the distance, remember this: medieval people slept beside thunder, death, livestock, and bells. And they did it on straw. To fall asleep in the Middle Ages was never just a physical act. It was a spiritual one, solemn, vulnerable, and always shadowed by the possibility that this night might be your last. Life then was fragile. Death didn't announce itself politely. It came in fevers and coughs, in fire, famine, and quiet bleeding. A scratch could turn fatal. A cough could be a sentence. Sleep, therefore, became something more than rest. It was a threshold. And each night before crossing it, people turned to prayer, not for sweet dreams, but for the safety of their souls. There were no bedtime podcasts, no scented oils to lull the body into peace. Instead, there were whispered confessions, fingers drawn across foreheads in shaky signs of the cross, verses spoken aloud in darkened rooms where the only light flickered from a dying fire or a lone candle guttering in the corner. Children were taught early, not just to say their prayers, but to say them like it mattered. Because it did. The world was full of sin, and the night was when sin came looking. The devil, it was said, worked hardest in the dark. A soul that went to sleep unprepared might wake up in the wrong place. So they spoke the words again and again, "If I should die before I wake." Today, it sounds like a nursery rhyme. Then it was more like a legal clause offered to heaven. One last plea for mercy before surrendering to unconsciousness. Some had memorized prayers for every occasion. A prayer for guilt, a prayer for storms, a prayer for protection from spirits that might creep in through dreams. Saints were invoked by name, some to guard the room, others to watch the body. There were saints for children, saints for sleep, saints for those who feared they might not wake. Monks, nuns, and the deeply devout followed a stricter rhythm. Their day ended with compline, the final service of the evening. It was not casual, not optional. After compline came silence, total, deliberate silence. No speaking, no singing, only stillness. The world shut its mouth, and the monks shut their eyes, not with trust, but with obedience. For the rest of the faithful, prayer was a form of nightly armor. Husbands prayed over wives, mothers murmured over sleeping children, one by one, like warding spells. Words were repeated like charms, not out of tradition, but out of raw fear, because the threats were real. A thatched roof could catch fire. Bandits could arrive before dawn, or worse, plague, invisible and merciless. You might go to bed with a headache and never rise again. No one was too young, no one was too holy. And so the prayers continued, soft and desperate, sometimes muttered while already half asleep, sometimes spoken with urgency, as though bargaining with something unseen standing just beyond the door. Some even fasted or wept before bed, not out of melodrama, but because sleep, real, deep, unguarded sleep, required faith, or at least hope. Children were told angels watched them while they slept, but angels were not always gentle. Sometimes they were sentries, keeping watch for signs of disobedience. Sometimes they were reminders that someone was always watching, comforting perhaps, or unsettling. Sleep was never just rest. It was a ritual, a risk. And prayer was the lock you placed on the door between this world and whatever waited beyond it. Because if your heart stopped in the night, and sometimes it did, you needed to be ready. You needed to have said the words. When we dream today, we often dismiss it. Just the mind spinning its wheels, sorting memory and emotion in a way that doesn't make much sense. We might laugh about the strangeness of it, or scroll through online interpretations half seriously over morning coffee. But in the Middle Ages, dreaming wasn't entertainment. It was deadly serious, and sometimes dangerous. To dream in those centuries was to receive a message. From heaven, from hell, from somewhere in between. It wasn't your brain misfiring. It was your soul receiving instructions, or temptations, or judgments. Sleep didn't shut the door on the world. It opened another one, and what passed through it could follow you into the day. A dream of fire, that might mean divine wrath, or perhaps the fires of hell licking at your conscience. A dream of water could be cleansing, or a sign you are drowning in sin. Dreams of animals were read with care. A snake, deceit. A lamb, innocence. A man with a goat's head juggling fish. Well, best to summon a priest and maybe start packing. The church paid close attention to dreams. Monks recorded them, nuns confessed them. Some were considered visions, holy messages sent through sleep. Others were labeled as delusions, traps, or even spiritual attacks. Entire treatises were written to help decode them. What did it mean if you flew, or fell, or kissed someone forbidden? Was it prophecy or possession? Theologians debated the boundaries. Could a soul sin in a dream? Was a wicked act committed in sleep a reflection of hidden vice? Or was it a temptation placed there by the devil, trying to erode your resistance from within? The answers varied, but caution was universal. For some, dreams were divine, visits from saints, glimpses of future events, answers to prayers. There are records of visions that changed lives, redirected entire communities, or sent kings charging into battle. A monk might dream of an angel placing a sword in his hand. A farmer might see the Virgin Mary weeping beneath a tree. These weren't dismissed. They were shared, copied, canonized. But not all dreams brought comfort. There were dreams that left people shaken. of death, of judgment, of falling into endless pits. Dreams of being hunted, of being watched, and of faces that hovered at the edge of sleep and whispered truths you didn't want to hear. These were feared, interpreted, purged with prayer. Some dreams were considered demonic, planted not by God, but by dark spirits seeking to corrupt. A lustful dream could be blamed on a succubus, a violent one on a restless soul or demonic influence. In extreme cases, dreamers were examined, exorcised, or shamed into repentance. Sleep became a battleground, not just of body and mind, but of moral struggle. Even children's dreams were taken seriously. Parents taught them to confess not only their deeds, but their sleep, to pay attention, to remember, because in sleep the soul was active, and if your dreams revealed secrets, whether of virtue or vice, it was better to bring them into the light than to let them fester. But dreams weren't just spiritual puzzles. They were also stories, deeply woven into medieval literature. Poets and scribes used them as frames for allegory, as doorways to moral exploration. A knight dreams of a rose in a burning tower. A monk dreams of a feast, only to wake with an empty bowl. These dreams were tales within tales, used to teach, to warn, to inspire. Still, the suspicion lingered. Not all dreams were safe. Some were tricks, some were invitations, and some, it was said, were doors that opened too easily and let things in. So as the medieval world fell into sleep each night, it didn't do so lightly. Prayers were said, beds were blessed, and when dreams came, as they always did, people listened, not always with joy, but with fear, with awe, with the heavy knowledge that what the mind saw in sleep might be more than fantasy. It might be the soul speaking, or it might be something else.